In this lesson, we're going to learn how to create a basic material. Alright, so whenever you bring in assets, you may need to create materials to apply textures and to give it the final look that you want. So for us, what we're going to do is we're going to create or recreate the material for this amphora vase. So let's go ahead and drag this into the scene, and you'll see that that comes right up on top of that crate. Okay, it's pretty big. Amphoras usually are. But what we want to do is we want to recreate the material that we see on this object. So to do that, we'll go into our DT materials folder. You'll see that I have several materials already set up here. I just wanted to give you plenty to look at, so that way you know exactly how those assets materials were put together, and you can kind of explore those if you want. But to create a brand new material, what we'll do is we'll select the folder that we want that material to be in, and then we'll simply come up to New, and then Material. Selecting that's going to create a new material, and then you'll need to give it a name. In this case, I'm going to call this M for Material _ Amphora. Notice that it's saying that this asset already exists, so I need to give it a different name. So I'm going to say _01. Hit A or Enter on that, and then you'll see that we have a brand new material. Notice the checker pattern that's on it. So double click on that material, and that's going to bring up the material editor. Now at this point, what we can do is we can dock this up here in our tab. So to do that, I'm going to left click on the tab, and I'm going to drag that until it snaps into place. Now I can switch between my editor and my material editor, and it keeps things nice, clean, and organized. So now that I'm in my Amphora material editor, all I have to do at this point is start hooking in textures and information into my main material inputs. So this is going to give us the final result. Now you'll notice that in our material we have things like base color, metallic, specular, roughness, emissive, and so on. You'll also notice that some of these are grayed out. This information will be active or inactive based on the material domain that we select, and you can see that here. Let me go ahead and stretch that out there. You can see that by the material domain, the blend mode, and even the lighting model. Those three are the main ones that you want to worry about whenever creating materials. Now these others will also come into effect, but those are usually special cases. So for us, we're going to use the material domain of surface, because this is going to go on a 3D surface or a static material, static mesh. The blend mode that I want to use is opaque. An opaque material or blend mode means that what you see is what you get. It's going to apply itself onto that surface, and it's going to look exactly the way the texture does. Okay. Now the lighting model might be a little bit different. You can choose things like unlit, subsurface, or pre-integrated skin. Now I know that that goes off screen there, but you can see that. Let me go ahead and pull that down so you can see that a little bit differently. So default lit is usually what we'll be using whenever we create surfaces like this. So with that set, we will not be able to get into opacity or opacity mask or any of these others because of the options that we need here. Now once we have those determined, we can go ahead and bring in textures to start getting the look that we desire. So to do that, what I like to do is go into my content browser. The content browser can be found in the editor, okay, right here, and then we can choose in our textures folder the different textures that we want to use. So in this case, I have Amphora, Diffuse. Go ahead and select that, and then we'll go into Amphora, the material, and with that selected in the content browser, meaning that it's highlighted in yellow, we can hold down the T key and then left click in our view or in the graph. Notice that it creates a texture sample and then brings in that texture. Now we can also create the same texture sample. Let's go ahead and select it. You'll see that yellow highlight around it and hit delete. We can create that exact same texture sample by using a different method. We can right click and then we can type in our search and we can say texture sample, and if we need to we can find it right here, and it's going to bring that in, and because we still have that selected in our content browser, it's going to automatically input that texture. Now there's one more way that we can add in a texture sample, and that's using the palette here on the right side. We can simply search for that, the exact same way that we had just done, and you'll find texture sample here. Let's go ahead and put it in here. Now notice that in your palette you have the keyboard shortcut showing up here on the right hand side. So texture sample is T. That must be held down. Okay, let's go ahead and drag that into the scene here. So left click, drag that into your graph, and you see the exact same thing. So just a reminder, to use the keyboard shortcuts, hold down the keyboard shortcut, so hold down T, then left click in the graph, and it will place that in. Perfect. So now what I want to do is I want to bring this texture in and put that into my final result, okay, my properties of my material. So whenever we bring in something like this texture sample, we have these different outputs. These outputs have different properties. The first output is an RGB channel, meaning what we have here in all three channels, RGB, or red, green, and blue, is going to be output through this one. So what we see is output through here. Now we can also access the red and green, blue channels, and even the alpha channel of this texture. To see that information, all you have to do is simply double click on that texture. It's going to bring you back to your content browser and then have that item selected. Double click on it in the content browser and you'll bring up the texture browser, or the texture editor. Here we can take a look at our view, and we can view this texture based on the channels. So here's what we have in our red channel, here's what we have in our green channel, and here's what we have in our blue. All three of those combined will give us our final result. So let's go ahead and take that combined result and put that into base color. This is going to output the color of whatever is input. Okay, so here we have that material. Now this doesn't look all that great. We can add just a little bit more to that. We can add in things like some specularity to that. We could even add in some roughness, or we can add in a normal map. Okay, so to do this, we'll simply go into our content browser. You'll notice that there's not really an amphora normal map or anything like that, but we can use another normal map if we like. Let's go to our textures folder from our standard content that we brought in, and let's find one of those normal maps that looks kind of like concrete. So let's go ahead and actually just type that into our search, and let's see if we can find a normal map. Here we go. So that's a concrete panels. Let's do concrete poured, but let's find the normal map for that, and here we go. So with that selected, let's go into our material, hold down T on the keyboard, left click, and that will be brought in. Take the RGB channel and plug that into normal. Notice that we get a little bit of a bumpy surface on our amphora. Okay, notice the specularity. Now we also have the ability to adjust the specularity of our material by plugging in another map. So let's find a noisy black and white map that we can plug in here. So let's go to our content browser, and let's just take a look at some of these different pieces of content. Instead of having that concrete as a filter, let's close that and let's look at something different. Let's find a black and white image that we can use. So we have something like this macro variation. That might be pretty good. We could also use like this Perlin noise. Let's go ahead and use that. So with that selected, let's go back to our material, hold down T on the keyboard, left click and drag, or just left click, and that will bring in another texture sample with this black and white texture. Let's take its final combined result and plug that into specular. Notice that the amount of color or amount of light that is bouncing off of that does vary on some of the surfaces, so the light isn't quite gathering in some of those areas. Okay. Now we can bump up the amount by tiling this UV. Now to tile a texture, which is going to become very handy at a later time, we can use a UV coordinate node. This can be accessed by holding down U on the keyboard and then left clicking, and that will bring in a text coord. You could also right click and search for that, so let's say text coord. And actually let's do, let's see, texture. It should come up here. Let's find it here. It's going to be under texture. There's text cropping. Actually, let's type in this. Let's type in chord. I know that that's going to come up. And there's texture coordinate. You could also look for it over here. Okay, but this is what we need. Go ahead and plug that into the UV input here. And now what we can do with this selected, we can come over here to our details panel and we can adjust the tiling of this image. So if I want it to become larger, I'm going to put in a smaller value on my U and V. So let's do 0.5 on both of those. And you'll notice that nothing's happening here, but we can see that something's happening here. In order to see our changes right inside of our graph, we need to turn on live nodes and live update. Notice now that we get that change. So if I come in and I type in 1 again on this, you'll see that that changes the texture immediately. Let's go ahead and set that to 0.5. Now at any time that you change some values on an object, you can always left click right here on this little yellow arrow, and that will reset to default. Alright, so now that we've created a very basic material, we need to learn how to apply that. So to do this, we need to simply hit apply. That's going to save the changes that have been made, and then we need to save the material in our project. Notice the asterisk here. Once it's finished saving, that disappears. Let's go to our editor. Let's go to the DT materials, and if we find that material that we just created, you'll see that we have the original amphora, and then we have our amphora_01. We've just learned how to create a material. Now let's apply it to our object. This can be done a couple of different ways. We can left click and drag the material onto the object right in the scene. Okay? Or we can actually select the material. With the object selected that we want to apply it to, we can go to our details panel and choose apply selected from content browser. That will do the exact same thing. Now to ensure that we have the correct material, let's simply hit this browse in content browser, and that will actually select the object. Okay? We can double click on that object and we can take a look at the material that is applied to that. Let's go ahead and close down that static mesh editor, as it's not needed at this time. Alright, so now that we've learned how to create a basic material, let's go ahead and talk about how to create some basic lighting in our scene. So we'll get started with that next.